Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of By the Way to Purposeful Procurement. I'm joined, as ever, by my co-host, Fine-Tune CEO Rich Ham.
Hey, Phil. Nice to see you again.
Yep, likewise. Now, we're doing something a little bit different for the next two episodes of the podcast. We actually wanted to discuss some of the ways that our incentives are driving bad practices at suppliers. We're encouraging bad practices at suppliers, but also ways that suppliers are actually taking advantage and expanding their margins with us post the actual contract signature. Again, really because of the ways that we get involved or often don't get involved post-contract signature. And to do that, I thought we could invite a few of your colleagues and peers at Fine-Tune. I know you were a little bit nervous about that at the beginning, but you've got a great collection of experts who have. What I love about the team at Fine-Tune is you've got that experience on both sides of the table.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to invite a couple of them on the podcast over the next couple of weeks to talk about some of these challenges.
Yeah, my sheepishness really mostly related to a respect for your audience that I want. I've wanted to approach this project that we're doing this as a research project. We're conducting some journalism into a particular storyline, exploring whether or not there are flaws in the ways that procurement tends to be incentivized that are doing various forms of harm, and I really wanted it to be about that, the research project. I didn't want it to be a fine-tuned salesy thing. We're working in conjunction with Art of Procurement here and trying to deliver something that I think has value for your listeners and that the community would find interesting, and I think we're doing that, but. Yeah, I was a little uneasy about bringing in our executives in a bit of a parade, of these next couple of episodes. But the truth is, these are people who are, they held senior executive roles at a cross section of indirect service categories that are, I think it's fair to say, all in their own ways notoriously difficult expenses to manage, to source and manage. Frankly, they're highly complex services. And it's hard to find people. One of the challenges is, it's hard to find people who are willing to speak candidly about, where the bodies are buried and all the dirty little secrets of the industry. I have the benefit of one of my clients once referred to I loved this phrase. He referred to our team of VPs as Poachers Turned Game Wardens. And I love that. It's true. They were on the other side of the table, and now they're customer advocates working, to shine a light on all the areas that might, to bring truth to light and show, educate our clients as to where there was opportunity and money, lurking beneath the surface. And so, yeah, I do think it makes sense, but I also was a little sheepish about it. It's true.
Well, let's tee up today's guests, or the guests that will be featured. We recorded a few different interviews, short interviews that we're going to edit in to today's episode. And today will be Alex Carlson and Angie Claeys. So why don't you share a little bit about Alex and Angie?
Sure. Alex is our vice president of facilities management. When we entered this space a while back, we knew that as our firm had been diversifying, we increasingly found ourselves in competitive situations with large integrated facilities management providers, the likes of CBRE, JLL, et cetera. So I wanted to hire a facilities management guru, but particularly one who had been in the belly of the beast at one of the big IFM players. We had 700 applicants for the role, and we arrived at Alex Carlson, who's just a brilliant guy, and he's actually a past guest on AOP. He joined Kelly Barner, I think, back in June or July with an episode that was great. I think your listeners will really appreciate his insights. But he started his career in facilities at Target, then went and worked in executive roles at CBRE for a number of years. He's actually an interesting fact about Fine-Tune. We've got folks from all these various indirect service industries, but almost nobody from our team. In fact, until Alex, nobody from our team had ever come from procurement.
Yeah.
Alex is the one guy who has a procurement background because after his time at CBRE, his largest client there hired him away from CBRE, and he spent a number of years as a VP of category management at Wells Fargo. So Alex has been a buyer of FM services, a seller, a purveyor of FM services, and is now the extension in his capacity as VP of FM at Fine-Tune, an extension of dozens of large buyers of FM services, brilliant guy and fantastic insights within the FM world. So I think that'll be a great starting point. And a lot of the other categories that we're going to look at, a lot of companies think of as subsets of facilities anyway. So I thought Alex was a perfect starting point. Now, turning the page to Angie Claeys. Angie's been with our team for the better part of a decade now. Prior to that, she had spent her entire career in the uniform rental industry. She worked at Aramark, which is now Vestas, but she when I hired her away from Aramark, she was a VP of operations at Aramark. She had run her almost all of her career had been on the operations side, though. She had been the general manager of their largest plant in the country. Has a really, really unparalleled command of the supplier side P&L in that very complex industry. And so once again, just a world renowned level guru of a very complex indirect service that is especially challenging and problematic category for procurement folks to both source and manage on a continuous basis. So in each case, I think we're bringing forth really highly qualified experts that will have useful insights for the listeners.
All right, well, let's kick things off. We're going to, first of all, go into the conversation with Alex. So let's roll the tape on the conversation we had with Alex.
Great. Alex Carlson, welcome to By the Way. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So, Phil, I know this about Alex. You may not know it yet, but in Alex Carlson, we actually have an avid listener to the not just Art of Procurement broadly, but even specifically to the By the Way project. Alex is even a person I've consulted with behind the scenes a little bit about the By the Way project, but I know he listens to all our episodes, and I know that Alex is aware that we just recently spoke with David McCarty, one of the original founders of Corporate United, the kind of the original industrial world GPO. And, given Alex's background as an executive at an integrated facilities management company and his broad expertise throughout the IFM world, I want to start by getting Alex's thoughts on kind of the parallels or the connection points between the GPO world and the IFM world through the prism of the conversation we're having here, the broader conversation of procurement incentive plans and the flaws that may exist within them. Alex, on that topic, go.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned GPOs and IFMs because they are very much related, Rich, and I think they're both an example at a high level of a convenience play from a client's perspective, having sat on that side of the fence. And I previously saw GPOs and IFMs alike being used when scale and scope became too complex to be managed internally. So I think a client tends to assume that when you're moving to an outsourced program like that, that all related costs are going to be managed. And one of the lines, as you know, Rich, that we use internally is don't confuse a managed service with a managed cost. And just because something's under management doesn't mean that it's actively being managed according to a client's best interests or expectations. And with that IFM hat previously, I think the ultimate recipe you're looking for as a seller in that service or in those industries is a buyer that's seeking convenience and then consolidation. And of course, there's themes of cost savings and risk management that are going to be mentioned from time to time and routinely in those prospect discussions, but that eternal efficiency layer tends to be the main factor. And I think lastly, I'd just say large IFM programs tend to be tied to a specific supplier or a few preferred suppliers per category. And what that really means is your IFM program or model, it's just not built for that partner to consistently defend your bottom line. So really similar, and that's what came to mind as listening to that conversation.
Quick follow-up there, Alex. It occurs to me that, within the entire expense world, there are certain kinds of expenses that tend to flow through the IFM, and they tend to be indirect services. Indirect services, in certainly in my experience, and I think I kind of know you share this viewpoint, are the sorts of expenses where the vendor tactics built around grabbing margin after deals are put in place are most widespread, where there are just such a vast quantity of them. And vendors, I think it's fair to say, but I want to hear your thoughts on this, see an opportunity within the IFM structure, within the IFM relationship, to kind of run those tactics to a high degree of success. Is that a fair statement? And if so, why?
Yeah, absolutely fair. And I'd say even especially, I mentioned preferred and used air quotes there. In those preferred relationships, as a supplier that's been brought in by your IFM that you're not going anywhere. So as I think we've talked about previously, these people know the game. So yeah, it's absolutely something that when you're brought in and you have a preferred relationship with the IFM as a third tier supplier, your first concern is the IFM. The second concern is then your client. So ultimately, yes, there's absolutely, it's a fair assumption to say that goes on in this space. And that's just a quick response where my mind immediately goes is those preferred relationships. You don't have in incentive alignment with the client. In fact, it's somewhat of an adverse relationship there from the IFM to a third party supplier. So absolutely that exists.
So I know there's dozens really of subcategories that fall under facilities management. I wonder if you could kind of dig deep into a couple of those categories to share some of the tactics that you see are often used by some of the suppliers to really make sure that even at the time of sourcing, there may be a tactic, maybe tactics post-sourcing to grab as much one margin, but also increasing spend as possible that might not relate to the deal that was signed in the first place.
Yeah, and Phil, two examples come to mind. It may go in a slightly different direction, but I think the examples will track. So I'll start with janitorial. And the way that you phrased that question, this one fits perfectly. And that's in this world, most service agreements follow that 3 to 5 year RFP cycles. I'm sure you've seen as well. Janitorial vendors know that game, and they know to win the business and notably to help the procurement team on the other side check the box with those cost saving goals. They're going to have to be the low bid or at least towards the bottom in that mid to low tier space. Mm-hmm. So they know going into those discussions and through the discussions, they have to sharpen their pencils through the bid process. But the other dynamic, in order for those pricing teams to not lose favor with their operators that will perform the work, is you tend to submit an overly limited scope or proposal and then work to win back margin through above scope work. And in this category, that's where the margin lives, is that above scope work. So there's a number of examples there. If it's window cleaning, upholstery, things like floor care, or even high dusting that kind of live in that space. But I've seen this up close and personal. And I'll say, disclaimer that not every janitorial company operates this way, but there are some known in the industry as those that just are going to win the business. They're going to be the low bid to win the business. And then after the deal is signed, they'll find a way to make it profitable, which puts clients in a pretty precarious situation in those scenarios.
Now it puts the bottom line in a precarious situation. I would ask you, Alex, does it not also in some respects play into the incentive structures that most procurement professionals are handed? Is it not somehow complementary with those incentive plans?
Oh, it absolutely is. And I think, Rich, something that has come to mind to me is I have heard firsthand examples that I'm sure you and Phil have seen this as well, but I've seen firsthand examples where the procurement team, and it's whether it was sourcing or if it's category management working on the deal, but telling the vendor on the way in, hey, make sure you get all of the scope. And this is a big job. Make sure you really consider the scope. So you're telling them without telling them to increase their first price so that you can help them whittle it down. And knowing that their incentive plan from a sourcing perspective, at least in one example I saw firsthand, that their incentive plan was based on how much they brought down the negotiated deal from the first price that came in. And so, yes, that absolutely plays into it. And through this process, you can then lower the base price, but then not be held accountable for that secondary price, which is the ongoing P&L.
Yeah, and I think as procurement professionals, sometimes and I say we, I mean, I can talk from personal experience of doing this, you kind of coach participants in an RFP process to align with, how you're able to measure savings, depending on what your savings methodologies may be, or depending on, like, when you go in, this is the output that I would like to see based on the incentives structure that I am measured by. So you're coaching the providers to go and do that. So you're already sending signals to them that I want you to come in low because that's how I can measure success.
And when there's above scope, outside beyond scope work at 60% margin instead of the 5% margin that was originally proposed, it probably doesn't change the procurement professional's reported savings in any respect. That's already done. That happened. The savings was claimed when the deal was put in place, and perhaps procurement is now looking at operations saying, "Oh, you didn't manage to the contract." When there was never a prayer of managing to the contract because the scope was preposterously low to begin with. Do I have anything about that wrong, Alex?
No, and in fact, it's as if you were there, Rich, with me. I think that's exactly right. And what we would say is, and I've been on a couple of different, from the supplier side to the category management side, working closely with sourcing. But as you hear in the space, the ball was lobbed over the wall, right? So I think one of the things that probably should be said more often in procurement circles is that compliance does not naturally exist in service agreements. And it may be a desired outcome, but it's not realized without intentional action. And to your point, a simple reason is that the approvers, or those that were most involved with creating or developing the contract, they're rarely involved with managing services or ongoing costs. And plug for fine tune, but I think that's where we play a really important role in closing that gap and advocating for clients in that way.
How important do you see that post-contract or post-contracting management? Because a lot of times the ways that procurement organizations are structured, so goes back to the system itself of procurement, is you sign the deal and you pass the deal on to the business, the budget holder, to manage, and procurement doesn't really get involved, which is why we don't really see some of the scope creep and the additional cost. We only see it if either a stakeholder complains to us about it, that a supplier is doing this to me, or when it comes to understanding our spend next time we go and source it. I say, it ended up being a lot more than we thought it was going to be.
Look how it all went to hell after I negotiated that thing.
Look
exactly.
Look at that high baseline that I've got to now try and get savings.
Hey, low-hanging fruit.
Right. But we often aren't involved because we don't have the bandwidth or that we're not set up to manage contracts after. Is that where a lot of this, the risk occurs? Is really how closely are you managing, and do you have governance, and do you have metrics and things like that to protect against this, as opposed to tossing the contract over the fence, saying to the business, there you go, and I'll see you in 3 years when it's up for renewal again.
I think I think your first question, Phil, is exactly correct. How it's so important to be post managing the agreement that's been reached, and for so many reasons. But I think right now what I'm seeing is that some assume that technology will do that. I've had a conversation before with my peers that are saying, well, we have rate cards in a system, and that's great. In the facilities world, a lot of times that's your CMMS system, right? That's a hybrid invoicing system and a workload engagement system for the vendor. They can't interpret context. So even if you have the right rates in there for, say, overtime, it's not necessarily going to know when that should be used. And so you put a lot on the supplier to be acting with integrity the whole way through it. And then your frontline teams, back to the broader point, they don't know the contract in the same way, the context of the contract in the same way that a category manager or those in sourcing would know, but they're not going to be consulting that at all times. Phil, your point is one that I've said many times. In facilities operations, you get your hand slapped for when something is offline or when something didn't get done. You can always have a variance explanation in the budget and the financial review after the fact, but it's much easier to have that when you said, I got that thing fixed on the executive floor so that it's done, and hence the budget overspend. It's so much easier to do that than it is to say that, well, we didn't do that because we were really holding to the budget. In facilities worlds, you do have to balance those operational outcomes with the cost, of course. But I think that's where things can routinely get sideways if you're not managing it to that extent. And that handoff is something it's thrown over the wall. It's not usually a clean handoff.
Alex, our listeners are coming here for the nuggets that our leaders from Fine Tune are sharing with them from having been in the belly of the beast in various industries. And I can't let you get out of here. We're going to get you out of here after this one, but I can't let you get out of here without delivery. I heard you say you had a couple of examples, and we got one of them in janitorial, but there's another one still floating around out there. We got to deliver the nuggets to the people. What is the second example you thought of when Phil asked you for vendor tactics within the facilities management world?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it back up, Rich. And my next example will be in the elevator space. And this one is going to be on the theme of services billed but not performed, something that I think my peers may reference in their respective categories as well. And with that theme in mind, while there's a lot of different expenses inside the elevator category, I'm going to skip over modernizations, construction, and emergency repairs, and just focus on contract maintenance. So elevator maintenance is required by code in your contract. And sometimes as a client, you might be thinking of the annual testing or the inspection certificates that come with those annual testings, or a 5-year load test. But the primary source of recurring fees in the elevator space on the maintenance line come from those more frequent visits for monthly, quarterly, semi-annual preventative maintenance. And while those can be really well outlined in an agreement, there tends to be gaps across the board with service completion. But on the other hand, there's usually not gaps when it comes to the auto billing and the auto payment. So especially in national agreements. And I saw a really large elevator program in my former life. And as that scope increases, your ability to monitor every area, every cab within the program is really limited. So I think this is where you need to have national service agreements that have some teeth to enforce monitoring, as otherwise it can be really easy margin to skip the scheduled maintenance intervals and just focus on compliance. Hopefully that gives you a couple of nuggets there for the elevators.
Fantastic nuggets. Thanks so much, Alex. And then,
well, we want to thank you so much for joining us today, Alex, and sharing some of your experiences, specifically in the facilities and IFM space, to help us kind of build a picture of all the different ways that suppliers are really taking advantage of lack of involvement, I think, post-deal signature.
Indeed. Yeah. Thanks so much, Alex. And it provides kind of a perfect entry point to some of the other categories we're going to explore in this episode and the next that kind of roll up ultimately to the universe of facilities management expenses. So thanks a ton. That was great.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So lots of great insights there from Alex. And as we teed up at the beginning of the episode, let's now go into the conversation that we had with Angie. Angie, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Now, the uniforms category is incredibly complex. There's lots of opportunities for supplier margin grabbing tactics. And so I wonder if you could share, what you were able to share, a couple of things that you see on a kind of day in, day out basis in the uniform category.
Yeah, sure. No problem. I think of it broadly in the industry and from a perspective of products and services, honestly, that clients don't have or are not being serviced necessarily by the suppliers, and certainly at the frequencies that are on the invoice. That would be one of the aspects for margin in the industry. And one we could go in deeper if you want. And then another one certainly is ancillary charges, like loss and ruin, is another area in which the suppliers in the industry look for margin.
Angie, I heard kind of three headings there. Let's start with the first one, product that doesn't exist. Okay. And I, as Phil is aware, before starting Fine Tune many years ago, I was a little mini expert in the uniform industry. I'd worked for the industry leader in the space for a couple of years prior to starting Fine Tune. You've forgotten more about this expense than I ever knew, and yet I know just enough to be dangerous. So I want to throw an example at you and get your reaction. When you talk about product that appears on an invoice, but in reality literally doesn't exist at the customer location. Imagine I were showing you an invoice for let's say like a large life sciences or pharmaceutical company that had clean room facilities, and within the clean room facilities, they were renting their spacesuits or whatever they're wearing in the clean room operations. And let's say I were to show you a line item on an invoice that says at this particular clean room facility, this customer has 10,000 frocks that they're renting every week. When you're looking at that line item on the invoice, how many frocks are you assuming actually exist at that site?
Good question. I would look at that, and first of all, off the top, 50% would be my first guess at what the customer actually has.
So if it says 10,000, you're thinking there's probably only about 5,000 there.
Correct. Yes.
Now, how does that happen? What is there a backstory to it? Like how do we get to the point where a customer is getting billed for 10,000 of something, and yet there's only half of that quantity in reality?
Yeah, I think of it from a perspective of when was the invoice set up? And just using an example, the department was set up at some time in the past with presumably the employee headcount that would be in that department for that item. And the customer at the time is thinking through, what is my demand going to be on a daily basis, a weekly basis? What if my employees need to change for whatever reason into a new suit? And they set that inventory level. But in reality, how often then does the customer come back and verify that that's still the count in which they need? And so they set that inventory level, and they're going along, and the invoice is reading as if you have 10,000 of that item. And when we see an inventory in particular that high in a uniform arena, in clean room specifically, in bulk inventory specifically, we start asking two questions there. And one of them is, do you have what the invoice says you have? And you would assume that it is exactly what the invoice says. But again, remember that level was set at some point in the past and likely unchecked. The second point of that is, are you using what the invoice says? So let's just assume for a second you do have the 10,000. Do you still need that 10,000? Because again, the inventory level was set in the past. So those two questions really, our team is looking at, sorting through, counting, and in a lot of scenarios, we end up in what my first answer was: the inventory is just simply not there. And it is very unlikely for it to all be there. And if it is, the customer does not need it. They are not using it because that level was just set too high.
Phil, we've actually on occasion sent our team, simultaneously on the same day, one member of the uniform team to the customer location, another member to the supplier plant, to reconcile where we know where all the product is, and we just literally going through and doing the very glamorous work of just counting it and going like, it's not 10,000, it's 4,800. And then, as Angie said, do you have what the invoice says you have? No, it says 10,000. We have 4,800. Are you using what you actually have? That's the next layer. Oh no, there's 1,500 that sit on a shelf every week and never get used at all. And so in this inventory of 10,000, there's 3,300 that's actually getting used. It shows you, I think it's informative in terms of how limited the effectiveness of a good unit cost can be. You could have the perfect unit cost in that example and be overspending by threefold potentially. And
it sounds like there's a similar problem on services as well. It's not just physical items.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Similar problem as well. And I'll use a simple example. Let's just talk about soap for a second. You have the dispenser, you have the soap. You can see on your invoice you're being charged for that soap every single week at the right rate, the rate that you negotiated. But the question is, did you need that refill every week? Likely not. What's happening is the dispenser and the soap are there, your employees are using it, but it's probably just being topped off every 4 to 6 weeks. Or you are direct purchasing that item, and it's again only delivered to you 4 to 6, 8 weeks even sometimes. And you're probably, in a lot of scenarios have some back stock of those refills sitting somewhere, just because your team isn't going through it as fast as the invoice is charging you.
Angie, let's pivot to one of the more maddening aspects of this particular expense, uniform rental. And it involves an area of the expense where there's so much supplier discretion. And we're talking here about loss and ruin or loss and damage charges, which in some environments, like you get into heavy industry, steel, this can be half a customer's spend in the category. It all relates to losing and damaging and ruining product. And so there's a phenomenon that we have noted at Fine Tune that's really proliferated over the last 10, 15 years or so, that comes into play when employees either leave the company, leave a department and move to a new department, get terminated for whatever reason. Talk to us a little bit about what you see in those situations when it comes to the suppliers imposing loss and ruin charges.
Sure. I think, there's a presumptive approach, broadly speaking, that the customer has lost the item or the customer has ruined the item. That's just the initial approach. And so there isn't a thought process about the supplier thinking through, have they lost any items or have they ruined any items? And when the billing is coming through and we start to see, Jane is off the invoice and it's 11 shirts and 11 pants billed, we start asking the questions. Did we check Jane's locker to see if those uniforms are there? Did a conversation happen before the billing occurred on the invoice for all of those 11 shirts and 11 pants? And also we go back to that inventory question. When did Jane receive the shirts and pants? Does she have all of the shirts and pants before, let's say, she was terminated or transitions department? So a lot of questions come in and we're geared towards asking, was there a mutual agreement around that billing before it occurred? Because the industry in general, again, is presumptive and takes a place of it's just not here and it needs to be billed for.
Yeah, the moment Jane leaves, we're billing you for all of her uniforms as if they were lost, and you're going to have to come to us and prove that they weren't, and until then, we're billing you for 22 uniforms. By the way, after presumably for a period of multiple years, making a rental rate, billing rental each and every week, and then on the back end, getting to bill for the product itself as if it were lost, when in many cases it wasn't at all to begin with. Great answer, Angie. Appreciate that. My last question here is, so we know that there's so many buttons that uniform vendors push and levers that they pull to change the game after a deal gets signed, to grow margin over time within an account. Have you seen an increase in these strategies and tactics over the last, say, 15 years from 2010 to current?
Yes. Simply speaking, the answer to that is yes. It is likely one of the easiest ways to grow margin in the uniform industry is to look for additional loss and ruin, and to then charge it back to the customer. And in a lot of instances is one that goes unchecked too by clients.
Awesome.
Now, yeah, I do have one final question. One of the themes that's kind of going through all the podcasts in this series is incentive structures and misaligned incentives. And I'm wondering, you talked about the example about the clean room inventory, and it started off in the right place, but just over time, enough changes happened where you end up billing for things that don't exist. And that's not necessarily how it started, but that's how it finished. Is that because there really isn't an incentive structure that would incentivize the supplier to actually keep a track of that and be, doing their own inventory so that they know that they're charging exactly what they are using? And on the flip side, is there incentive structures that you can put in place that will hold them more accountable to make sure that that kind of leakage over time and then compounding of that doesn't happen?
Yeah, so the incentives on the supplier side is really, simply put, to keep the revenue. And so if the inventory was set at 10,000 in the industry, they're looking for growth and they're setting growth targets. And if that inventory were reconciled, adjusted, lowered, then all of those lead to something the supplier isn't looking for. That's not going to be growth. And so the incentive isn't there. It's actually quite the opposite, right? They are looking for, how do we grow that revenue on that line or any other given line? And so no incentive would be in place to push for a reconciliation or a review of that inventory.
Yeah, they booked the revenue based on 10,000 pieces, for example, and
Correct.
anything lower than that is just going to be a hit to the revenue for that account.
Uniform vendors don't even like taking people's names off invoices when they leave the company. And on occasion, through our 20 plus years at Fine Tune, we have found literally deceased people that have been billed, for a year or more after they not just left the company but this earth, sadly. And so they don't like taking any little tiny bit of revenue off an invoice if they can avoid it.
All right. Well, thank you, Angie, for your time and just sharing a little bit about the uniforms category. I'm sure there's a lot more detail we could go into, but we're really just looking for some of the tactics that we're seeing with suppliers out there that they're using to really maintain, grow that revenue over time to the detriment of really the buyer and the buyer's experience and what the buyer should be expecting from them. So we appreciate your time today.
Thanks for the nuggets,
Thank you
Angie.
so much.
Phil, we're going to press the pause button here and come back to our listeners in 2 weeks' time. And I really enjoyed today's discussions with Alex and Angie. When we return, we're going to be talking to two other gurus of complex indirect service categories. The first up will be Bob Schreiner, who comes from the security guard space, and the second will be Keith Robinson from the pest control industry. We'll give more detailed bios on each of them when we start our next episode, but suffice it to say, everybody should tune in once again next time, because there's going to be a stream of useful nuggets and actually some comedy as well will ensue, I think, especially in the pest control conversation with Keith. So come back, listeners. We look forward to seeing you next time.
And who doesn't like some comedy?
Of course, yeah, we need more of that in our procurement discussions.
All right. Well, with that said, we'll be back in a couple of weeks, and we hope you all take care. We'll talk to you soon.
Great.